I recently posted an introductory video on doing a 30-point checklist if you're planning on going on a long 1,000 to 3,000 mile road trip in an old Mercedes-Benz. And I posted those 30 items in the description of the video. So if you got a chance to look at that list, you'll notice that I broke the list down into 3 categories. The first category is safety, the second category is reliability, and the third category is performance. And the very first item on my list, and some of you may have seen this, thought, what's he talking about? Throttle linkage? That's a safety issue? Yes, it is. And the reason that's number 1 is because it's something that no one ever thinks about or doesn't even realize that it could be a big problem. Now, if you've been around these old Mercedes, particularly these old diesels as long as I have, you may have experienced some of the same excitement and possible fear that I have when suddenly the engine goes to full throttle and there's nothing you can do to slow it down short of shutting the engine off. And that can get really exciting if you're on the freeway. So this is something I want to really stress, and that's why it's number 1. I've had 3 Mercedes diesels go to full throttle and stick. And you can't believe it. You just literally cannot do anything. You know, it just happened a few weeks ago on this blue 300D of mine, and I even lubricated all the linkage, okay? Lubricated all the linkage, that's what I do when I right away when I get one of these cars, but I was out doing a speed test, and this got real exciting. I was actually filming it, and I want to show you the film here. You can see I'm accelerating, and I'm going faster and faster, and all of a sudden you start hearing this funny noise. Well, that's me banging on the throttle with my foot, trying to get the throttle to release, and it wouldn't do it. And finally, I just threw the phone down. You can see I threw the phone down here. And I prepared to shut the engine off. Unfortunately, this engine had been having some shut-off problems. So it didn't shut off right away. So I had to hit the brakes to keep the engine from over-revving. Finally, it shut off. Of course, when you're going 70 miles an hour and the engine shuts off, you lose your power brakes, you lose your power steering, and hopefully you're on a back road like I was. So I'm going to tell you right away, you get one of these old Mercedes, one of the first things you do is go through all the linkages, the pivot points, all the ball sockets. It's usually the pivot points that seize up on these. So you'll push down on the throttle and suddenly the throttle won't come back. Well, wait until you see what happened to this engine. I mean, I've never seen this before, but it's like everything in life, you constantly keep learning, because man, this was kind of scary when it happened on this 300D. So I want to show you now, you're going to be as surprised as I was when you find out that this little teeny part could cause such a big problem. You can see the linkages are moving very smoothly. I had lubricated these pivot points, I had lubricated all the ball sockets. I think one of the reasons this occurs more with a diesel engine than a gas engine, there's so many more linkages. When you have sometimes as many as 10 ball sockets and 4 pivot points that can cause a problem, then it's more likely that the throttle could stick. So, I mean, I was totally surprised that that throttle stuck at full throttle when I was doing that road test. And I got out, finally got the engine shut down. I looked, opened the hood, and I said, I can't believe it. Watch what happens when I take this and go to full throttle. Look at that, locked up solid. And I was sitting here banging on the pedal trying to get it to release, and it wouldn't because I didn't have enough pressure coming back here to pull it back. And look what caused it. Can you believe that? This is a 3-2 valve. That's the pin on the end of a 3-2 valve, and that little nylon lever has worn off, allowing the pin to come in here and jam up against this plastic cam. Who would have thought that that could happen? So now, not only should you be looking at lubricating all your linkages, but you better make sure your 3-2 valves are functioning properly with the levers that are not worn off. I'm going to show you one of these levers now so you can see it up close. But look at that. See that? I had to actually, beat on it like this to get it to release. Of course, if you're not at full throttle, that's not a problem. But once again, I floored it, and this is what happened. Locked the throttle up wide open. And that was a very exciting road trip. With this 3-2 valve removed from the bracket here, you can see now there's no binding in the throttle at all. You can see that pin right there was binding up right on the edge of that camshaft. Now there's supposed to be a cover on this. It's a lever cover, and it's all broken off. This is what the lever cover looks like. Now this is broken off here, so I'm not going to be able to fix this just by replacing the lever. So I'm going to have to replace it with a new 3.2 valve, and you can see what that looks like. See, it was, as the cam rides up over that, it just rides right back. And you want to put some grease on that. Use synthetic grease, not petroleum-based grease. Keep this well lubricated so it doesn't wear out. That's one of the problems with these. People don't lubricate them, so eventually that nylon lever wears right through. And you might be saying, well, Ken, I don't know if that's such a big issue or a big problem. Not so fast. Watch this. These are all ones that I've removed from various diesel engines over the last 10 years. Look at that. One lever's missing, the other's almost completely worn through. This one here, both of them are worn through. Here's another one. See, those are both worn through. That lever's missing. Here's another one. You can see they're just barely in place here. Just barely enough to keep that pin from sticking on the cam. So this is a real alert for you diesel owners. I know the position of some of these 3.2 valves is such that it would not cause a problem even with the lever removed, but in this particular 300D, this design allowed this pin to jam up on the end of that cam and keep the engine running at full throttle. So I've got other issues too, and you may have other issues. I've got a loose rubber piece in here. See all that slop? So I'm going to have to pull this off and do some work here. And I'm going to take you back to a video I did on the 240D, which I'm also prepping for a 3,000 mile road trip, and show you all the parts that I had to replace on that one. You always want to make sure your emergency stop is working, and you always want to make sure that your vacuum shutoff is working. Do not drive an old diesel with a vacuum shutoff that's not working. The other thing is you want to make sure you're getting full throttle. I had somebody get in this car and push on the throttle, and it's not quite coming up to full throttle here. You know, it's about a 1/16 of an inch off the stop here, and this is the reason why. Look, this is broken in here. So I need to replace that. I've got some slop in some of these ball joints, so I'm going to go ahead and get this replaced. Then I'm going to start replacing linkages from my old stock and see if I can't tighten up this whole linkage assembly. You can see how loose it is. So there's a number of places these can deteriorate. The rubber can rot and start to separate and crack, and this plastic ball can break apart like you see here, and that'll get really loose. Now we carry these new and used on my website. I've got a good used one, so I'm just going to replace that right now. Need to put it on like this, so this part is angled more towards the engine, and you can get the linkage installed back in properly. So I'll set that in place. Now I can go ahead and slide this linkage back in. This doesn't need any lubrication because it doesn't rotate in this little mount. I'll put that in like that. And now I'm going to get the lubrication. We're going to start removing, inspecting, and lubricating each one of these linkages. I like to use a little bit of Scotch-Brite pad to just clean these balls a little bit. They get rusty, and you want to get all the crud and the rust off before you lubricate them. And I've used quite a few different types of lubricant over the years to lubricate these linkages. If I take them off and clean them, my lubricant of choice is a synthetic. Whatever you use here needs to be a synthetic. I use this synthetic heavy moly grease. It tends to hold into these ball sockets real well, and it holds up well to the heat of the engine. That's the key. You don't want to use regular oil, particularly around these plastic parts, the plastic pivot points, because it will deteriorate the plastic. Most of these will snap on by hand, but when they're a little old, a little tight, and haven't been lubricated on that spring clip, you may need to take a pair of needle nose pliers like this and just snap it back into place. All right, that feels good. Now I'm going to just start here at the front at this cruise control actuator, and I'm going to just take off 1 or 2 linkages at a time and inspect them, look at the ball sockets for slop or rust, but look at how much play I've got here. And I've got a lot of play in this pivot point too, so maybe I've got a better one of these in my old used part stock. And if I can find better linkages, I will use them. If not, I will have to get some new ball socket ends and replace them because I don't want this much slop in the linkages. This cruise control pivot arm bushing is really worn, see that? So I was able to find one. It's not perfect, but it's certainly a lot better. There's a lot less play in it. So I'm using this one, but before I install it, I'll get to that Moly synthetic grease. I'm actually going to put some up in here so it doesn't push all out the bottom. Okay, there you go. You never know when you might need some old parts you pulled off a car probably 10 years ago. But I was able to find 2 linkages a lot better condition than the ones I removed. So we're going to lube these up. Okay. Okay, that one's a little tight. What happens is that spring clip down in there gets rusty and it won't release the pressure. So a little grease in there, a little vibration will get that loosened up as long as I can get it on. If you have to force it too much to get it on, don't use the ball socket. It's probably shot. There we go. All right, from here to here, I have a lot less movement and slop. You can see that right there as I move it back and forth. I just replaced this linkage rod from my used part stock. Look at how tight that is. See that? Now this is the one I have to find next. Look at how sloppy these original ones are. That's moving almost a 1/16 of an inch. So when you multiply a 32nd or a 1/16 of an inch times 10, you've got an awful lot of slop going on in all this linkage before I started repairing it, and that makes it hard for the cruise control. It makes it hard for it to run smoothly at freeway speed. You're going to get probably other issues related to all that slop, but it's a good idea to have tight linkages. I finished using this ball here for testing, and now I can take this linkage and switch it over to this position. That's the correct position. I should warn you, it's easy to get confused, so maybe take some pictures before you begin taking all your linkages apart. Also, during this whole operation, I decided to build a better mousetrap with a better tool that I modified to get these ball sockets off easier. Look at this. Look at how nice that is. It just snaps right off. So I'm going to make this tool available on my website along with that special grease and some lint-free swabs to go along with it. I'm going to switch this one over to here, snap it into place. And now the last one I've got to do is that one I just cut. I'll go ahead and lube these up and snap that one in place. Now compare this linkage operation to what you saw at the beginning of the video. Look at that, there's almost no slop all the way from this point down to that ball that moves the rod to the injection pump and then going over to the firewall right there. Look at that, hardly any slop at all in this mechanism. This is going to make a lot of difference in how this car runs and shifts. Even a manual transmission will shift smoother with tight ball socket linkages. Now, one final thing when you're all done, you want to make sure that your throttle is not binding. If you got this on wrong, it's going to bind up and not go to full throttle. And then finally, have someone get in the car and push all the way down on the throttle pedal and look down here and make sure that the injection pump is coming all the way to full throttle stop. If not, you may have to adjust some of these linkages. Just as soon as you bring an old Benz home, make sure you go through the entire linkage scenario, replace worn parts, replace worn ball sockets, and make sure everything gets lubricated, particularly the pivot points. Here's the new 3.2 valve ready to install on this bracket, but I realize that one of the bigger problems may be the adjustment of that cam. I think the linkages were adjusted or installed improperly so that it would allow this cam to go too far. It should be moving from about this position to about that position. So it really shouldn't be going so far as to hang up on the end of the 3.2 valve. So I've got more work to do. I've got a loose rubber part in here. You can see the slop, so I've got to remove this piece, and we've got to do some real inspection, and probably are going to end up replacing a bunch of these rods like I did on the 240D. I'll come back and show you what I run into when I finally get this fixed and adjusted properly. After replacing some of these linkage parts that were sloppy and loose, you can see this rubber is all twisted and hardened up. This is the firewall bracket that was real loose. So I replaced those, and then it became very obvious that we had a linkage adjustment problem, which was allowing this camshaft to go too far. So I adjusted the linkage, I replaced those parts, and now look at the operation. See, new 3.2 valve installed. You can see it's pushing it on the pin, but it's not going so far as to have that end of the cam go past the pin. So there's full throttle right there. See that? Now everything is moving smoothly. And so after all this, I think this is a really good example why you really need to pay attention to your throttle linkage, even if you're going on a 25-mile trip. I'm sure you understand now when I mention throttle linkage, it's a lot more than just lubricating the ball sockets and the pivot points. We're talking about looking for worn parts, we're talking about adjustment of the linkage, and we also want to talk about making sure you're getting full throttle. I don't know how many diesels I've gotten and people complaining about, hey, this thing's a dog, and you go to check the linkages and you find out that they're not even getting full throttle when they push the pedal all the way to the floor. So that's important as well. It's not so much a safety issue, but it might be if you're trying to pull out in front of traffic. I'm sure some of you watching are thinking, well, how do I find out about adjusting my linkages? Well, I've had a bunch of people ask me in the past about doing some videos or instructions on adjusting engine linkages. Well, the problem is there's so many different linkages with different models and different years. So what you need to do is you need to get the factory service manual for your particular engine. And those factory service manuals will have specific information, including the proper lengths to adjust your linkages to, and how to check for problems with them. So I'm not going to go over that in this video series. But in the next video, I'm going to talk about number two in my list of safety-related items that you want to inspect when you plan to go on a long cross-country road trip, and that's the front suspension.